In January 1968, as the Cold War's peripheral theaters absorbed pressures generated by superpower rivalry, the Korean Peninsula experienced one of its most dangerous and least discussed crises when a North Korean Special Operations Unit penetrated deep into South Korea with the explicit objective of assassinating President Park Chung-hee at the Blue House in Seoul. An operation that unfolded not as a spontaneous provocation, but as the culmination of a deliberate strategy by Kim Il-sung to destabilize the South through decapitation and political shock, rather than conventional invasion. The plan emerged within a broader North Korean assessment that the balance on the peninsula was shifting unfavorably as South Korea's economic consolidation, internal security apparatus, and alliance with the United States reduced the prospects for mass uprising, prompting Pyongyang to explore asymmetric means capable of reversing momentum without triggering immediate large-scale retaliation. In this context, the Blue House raid was conceived as a surgical strike designed to collapse South Korea's leadership, ignite chaos in the capital, and create conditions under which the regime in Seoul could be delegitimized or overthrown before its allies could respond decisively. The operational design reflected this ambition. As a hand-picked unit of 31 commandos from North Korea's elite special forces underwent months of intensive preparation, including political indoctrination, physical conditioning, and rehearsal in a full-scale replica of the presidential compound, with training emphasizing stealth, discipline, and the ability to operate autonomously once inside enemy territory. Their mission parameters were uncompromising, requiring infiltration across the heavily monitored border, movement through populated areas without detection, and execution of the assassination even at the cost of their own lives. An expectation that underscored the regime's willingness to expend elite personnel for symbolic and strategic gain. The infiltration began under winter conditions that favored concealment as the unit crossed the border in small groups, exploiting terrain and weather to avoid detection. And once inside South Korea, they adopted disguises intended to blend with local military patrols, relying on confidence and discipline to pass checkpoints and minimize scrutiny as they moved steadily southward toward Seoul. The audacity of the operation lay not only in its objective, but in its route, which carried the commandos within kilometers of the capital before any alarm was raised, revealing vulnerabilities in South Korea's internal security and highlighting the thin line between routine stability and sudden crisis in a divided state. The operation unraveled only when chance intervened, as the unit encountered civilians whose suspicions led to reporting, triggering a manhunt that rapidly escalated into armed confrontation on the outskirts of Seoul, where South Korean security forces and military units engaged the infiltrators in a series of firefights that shattered the illusion of control in the capital and exposed the proximity of the threat to the seat of power. The ensuing clashes were brief but violent, resulting in the deaths of most of the North Korean commandos, with only one captured alive, and the elimination of the immediate assassination threat did not dissipate the shock generated by the realization that a hostile force had come within striking distance of the Blue House itself. The psychological impact of the raid was immediate and profound, as it punctured assumptions about the impermeability of South Korea's defenses and underscored the degree to which the peninsula remained in a state of unresolved war, despite the absence of active frontline combat for President Park and his inner circle. The attempt was interpreted not merely as a tactical incident, but as a strategic warning that North Korea was prepared to escalate through unconventional means, compelling a reassessment of internal security, intelligence coordination, and the balance between civil control and militarization within South Korean society. The response was swift and uncompromising, as emergency measures expanded surveillance, tightened control over movement, and accelerated the consolidation of state authority, reinforcing a political trajectory in which security imperatives justified the curtailment of dissent and the strengthening of executive power. Internationally, the raid unfolded amid a broader escalation in East Asia, as it occurred within days of another major crisis involving American forces, amplifying concerns in Washington that multiple pressure points were being exploited simultaneously, and raising fears that miscalculation could cascade into open conflict. The United States, bound by treaty to South Korea, yet wary of uncontrolled escalation, faced the challenge of demonstrating resolve without triggering a cycle of retaliation that could draw in external powers, a dilemma that reflected the structural constraints of Cold War crisis management on a peninsula where the line between deterrence and provocation was dangerously thin. Within this framework, the Blue House raid assumed significance beyond its immediate outcome, serving as a case study in how assassination and covert action could function as instruments of strategic pressure, capable of destabilizing adversaries psychologically even when operational success was denied. For North Korea, the failure of the mission did not negate its intended signaling effect, as the raid demonstrated reach, resolve, and a willingness to challenge the status quo, reinforcing a pattern of behavior in which risk was used as leverage against opponents constrained by alliance politics and escalation fears. For South Korea, the episode reinforced a siege mentality that would shape governance and security policy for years, embedding the perception that existential threats justified extraordinary measures and that stability depended on vigilance rather than normalization. The Blue House raid thus unfolded not as an isolated act of violence, but as a calculated intervention into the Cold War balance on the Korean Peninsula, one that revealed the persistent volatility beneath the armistice and exposed the degree to which peace rested on deterrence, discipline, and the constant management of fear rather than on resolution, setting the stage for further confrontation and reinforcing the reality that, in 1968, all-out war remained a contingency only one misjudgment away. In the immediate aftermath of the Blue House raid, the crisis expanded rapidly from a localized security breach into a multi-layered confrontation that tested the limits of restraint on the Korean Peninsula, as South Korean authorities launched an extensive nationwide manhunt while attempting to project control in the capital, and the discovery that one of the North Korean commandos had been captured alive transformed the incident from a failed assassination into a prolonged political and psychological confrontation. The surviving infiltrator was subjected to intensive interrogation that revealed not only the operational details of the raid, but the strategic intent behind it, confirming that the mission had been sanctioned at the highest levels in Pyongyang and designed explicitly to eliminate President Park Chung-hee, a revelation that removed any ambiguity about intent and hardened perceptions in Seoul, that the North Korean leadership had crossed a threshold from harassment to attempted regime decapitation. These disclosures reinforced a growing conviction within South Korea's security establishment that the armistice line no longer represented the primary axis of threat, and that future conflict would likely unfold through covert penetration, internal disruption, and targeted violence rather than massed conventional assault, a reassessment that accelerated the expansion of counter-infiltration units, intelligence coordination, and internal surveillance mechanisms. The political consequences were immediate, as Park used the raid to justify the further consolidation of executive authority, framing heightened security measures as necessary responses to existential danger, and portraying dissent or opposition as vulnerabilities that could be exploited by an adversary willing to operate inside civilian spaces. This framing resonated with a population already accustomed to instability, reinforcing public acceptance of emergency powers and contributing to a security-first political culture that privileged order over pluralism. The raid also reverberated within the South Korean military, exposing deficiencies in coordination between police, army units, and intelligence services, and prompting reforms aimed at improving rapid response, information sharing, and urban defense as planners confronted the uncomfortable reality that a small, disciplined force had penetrated to the edge of the presidential compound with limited resistance. These reforms reflected a broader shift toward internal defense as a core military mission, blurring the distinction between external threat and domestic security and embedding counterinsurgency logic into the structure of the state. Across the demilitarized zone, North Korea's response to the failure of the mission was marked by calculated ambiguity, as official statements denied responsibility while simultaneously celebrating the ideological commitment of those involved. A dual posture designed to preserve deniability while reinforcing domestic narratives of revolutionary resolve. This ambiguity complicated crisis management, as it denied Seoul and Washington a clear target for retaliation without escalation, reinforcing the strategic utility of covert action as a means of applying pressure while avoiding conventional war. The United States, for its part, found itself managing overlapping crises as the Blue House raid coincided with heightened tensions elsewhere in the region, intensifying concerns that coordinated provocations might overwhelm response capacity and force difficult choices about escalation and restraint. American policymakers faced the dilemma of reassuring an ally that had just narrowly escaped political decapitation while avoiding actions that could trigger a spiral of retaliation on a peninsula where miscalculation had historically carried catastrophic risk. Washington's response emphasized deterrence and alliance solidarity, increasing readiness levels and reinforcing commitments, yet stopping short of actions that might legitimize North Korean claims of encirclement or justify further provocations. This calibrated response reflected lessons drawn from earlier Cold War crises, in which disproportionate retaliation risked entrenching cycles of violence rather than restoring stability, particularly in theaters where superpower interests intersected with local rivalries. Nevertheless, the psychological impact of the raid on American perceptions of the peninsula was significant, as it underscored the volatility of a frontline state whose internal stability was directly linked to broader regional security and whose leadership now appeared vulnerable to unconventional attack. Within this environment, the capture and subsequent fate of the surviving commando assumed symbolic importance, as his public statements and treatment were closely scrutinized for insights into North Korean intent and for their potential impact on public morale, illustrating how individual actors could become instruments of psychological warfare in a conflict defined by symbolism as much as by force. The broader strategic effect of the Blue House raid thus lay not in its immediate failure, but in its capacity to destabilize assumptions, exposing the fragility of deterrence in a divided society, and forcing all parties to confront the reality that escalation need not begin with armies crossing borders, but with small units exploiting seams in security and perception. As the crisis settled into an uneasy aftermath, the raid left behind a transformed security landscape in South Korea, one in which vigilance became permanent, internal control expanded, and the boundary between war and peace grew increasingly ambiguous, reinforcing the sense that the Korean Peninsula in 1968 remained suspended in a state of unresolved conflict, where even a single operation, narrowly foiled, could bring the region to the brink of all-out war. As the immediate crisis receded, the Blue House raid's deeper significance emerged through the way it reshaped strategic calculations on all sides of the Korean Peninsula, embedding itself into a broader pattern of escalation that defined 1968 as one of the most volatile years of the Cold War in East Asia, and revealing how assassination attempts and covert action could function as catalysts for systemic instability even when tactically unsuccessful. For North Korea, the operation's failure did not invalidate the underlying logic that had produced it, as Pyongyang interpreted the intense reaction in Seoul and Washington as confirmation that targeted violence could impose disproportionate psychological and political costs, reinforcing a belief that asymmetric operations offered leverage against adversaries constrained by alliance politics and fears of escalation. This belief was consistent with a broader North Korean strategy during the late 1960s that emphasized infiltration, sabotage, and political warfare aimed at eroding confidence in South Korean governance and provoking internal repression that could, in turn, delegitimize the regime domestically and internationally. The Blue House raid thus fit within a continuum of actions designed to probe defenses, test responses, and normalize a state of tension in which South Korea would be perpetually on edge, forced to allocate resources inward and to govern under the shadow of constant threat. For South Korea, the episode accelerated a transformation already underway, as security imperatives were used to justify the expansion of emergency powers, the tightening of political control, and the institutionalization of surveillance and counterintelligence as central functions of the state, developments that reinforced President Park Chung-hee's authoritarian trajectory and linked regime survival explicitly to national security. The raid's proximity to the Blue House provided a powerful narrative tool, allowing the government to frame dissent as potential complicity and to portray political opposition as a vulnerability rather than a legitimate component of democratic life. A framing that narrowed political space and reshaped civil-military relations in favor of centralized authority. Within the South Korean military and security services, the incident prompted sustained investment in counter-infiltration capabilities, urban defense planning, and intelligence penetration, reflecting a recognition that future threats would likely be subtle, deniable, and designed to exploit civilian environments rather than massed forces along the demilitarized zone. These adaptations blurred traditional distinctions between frontline defense and internal security, embedding a siege mentality into institutional culture and reinforcing the perception that the state existed in a permanent condition of emergency. The United States, observing these developments, faced a complex balancing act as it sought to support South Korea's security while managing concerns that excessive repression could undermine legitimacy and long-term stability, a tension that reflected broader Cold War dilemmas in which anti-communist allies often pursued internal control measures that conflicted with American rhetorical commitments to democratic governance. Washington's response to the Blue House raid therefore combined military reassurance with diplomatic caution, reinforcing deterrence while encouraging restraint in retaliation, an approach shaped by the recognition that uncontrolled escalation on the peninsula could draw in external powers and transform a regional crisis into a wider conflict. The raid also influenced American military planning, highlighting the need to anticipate unconventional threats and to integrate counter-infiltration and counterterrorism considerations into alliance strategy, a shift that mirrored broader trends in Cold War security, thinking as insurgency and covert action became increasingly prominent tools of competition. Regionally, the incident contributed to a climate of heightened alert, as neighboring states and actors reassessed the stability of the peninsula and the risks of miscalculation in an environment where symbolic actions could trigger cascading responses, reinforcing the perception that East Asia in the late 1960s was characterized by interlocking crises rather than isolated flashpoints. The Blue House raid thus functioned as a warning about the fragility of armistice-based stability, demonstrating that the absence of conventional war did not equate to peace, and that the line between provocation and conflict could be crossed through operations designed to exploit ambiguity and surprise. In the longer term, the episode entrenched patterns of interaction that would persist for decades, as North Korea continued to view covert action as a viable means of signaling resolve, and South Korea institutionalized a security-first approach to governance that prioritized control over openness. The persistence of these patterns underscores how the raid's impact extended beyond its immediate failure, shaping the evolution of the conflict in ways that reduced the likelihood of normalization and increased the salience of deterrence and vigilance as organizing principles. As a result, the Blue House raid stands as a critical episode in the Cold War history of the Korean Peninsula, illustrating how an assassination attempt, narrowly averted, could nonetheless recalibrate strategic behavior, harden political structures, and bring a divided region perilously close to renewed war without ever crossing the threshold into open hostilities. As the longer-term consequences of the Blue House raid became clearer, the episode came to be understood not simply as a failed covert operation, but as a structural shock that altered how conflict was conceived and managed on the Korean Peninsula, reinforcing a shift away from assumptions of static deterrence toward an acceptance of permanent instability managed through force, vigilance, and rapid response. For North Korea, the raid's aftermath confirmed that deniable, high-risk operations could be absorbed into the strategic environment without triggering full-scale war, a conclusion that validated the continued use of special operations and unconventional tactics as tools of state policy and encouraged the expansion of elite units trained for infiltration, sabotage, and political assassination. This recalibration was shaped by the realization that even unsuccessful missions could generate disproportionate effects by compelling the adversary to militarize internal life, divert resources, and govern through fear, outcomes that aligned with Pyongyang's broader objective of undermining South Korean legitimacy over time, rather than achieving immediate military victory. Within South Korea, the institutional memory of the raid hardened into doctrine, shaping security planning and political behavior well beyond 1968, as the perception of existential vulnerability justified sustained emergency measures and reinforced a narrative in which national survival was inseparable from centralized authority and internal discipline. President Park Chung-hee's regime leveraged this narrative to consolidate power, presenting the expansion of surveillance, censorship, and political control as unavoidable responses to an enemy willing to strike at the heart of the state, a framing that normalized exceptional measures and reduced the space for contestation within public life. This normalization had lasting consequences for South Korean civil-military relations, as security institutions acquired expanded mandates and political influence, embedding themselves deeply within governance structures and shaping policy priorities in ways that persisted long after the immediate threat had passed. The Blue House raid also influenced alliance dynamics, as the United States reassessed the nature of its commitments on the peninsula, recognizing that deterrence against conventional invasion was insufficient to address a spectrum of threats that included assassination, infiltration, and psychological warfare, and that alliance credibility depended not only on troop presence, but on the capacity to manage crisis escalation under conditions of ambiguity. This reassessment contributed to a more complex understanding of deterrence, one that acknowledged the need to respond proportionally to covert provocations while preserving escalation control. A balance that proved difficult to sustain in practice, but became a defining feature of Cold War crisis management in Korea. The raid's timing, occurring during a year marked by heightened global tension, amplified its significance as it intersected with parallel crises that strained American attention and resources, reinforcing North Korean perceptions that coordinated pressure could exploit moments of distraction and increase leverage without provoking unified retaliation. This perception encouraged a strategy of persistence rather than breakthrough, in which cumulative pressure was favored over decisive action, embedding a rhythm of provocation and response that would characterize inter-Korean relations for decades. From a broader Cold War perspective, the Blue House raid illustrated how localized actions could reverberate through alliance systems and superpower calculations, demonstrating that even small-scale operations carried strategic weight in a bipolar world where credibility, signaling, and perception were paramount. The episode underscored the vulnerability of frontline states whose internal stability was inseparable from international rivalry and whose domestic political trajectories were shaped as much by external threat as by internal choice. Analytically, the raid revealed the limits of armistice-based stability, showing that the absence of conventional warfare did not eliminate the risk of sudden escalation, and that the management of peace in divided societies required constant adaptation to unconventional threats. The persistence of tension after 1968, despite the absence of open war, reflected the success of deterrence in preventing invasion, but also its failure to address the underlying drivers of conflict, leaving both Koreas locked into a cycle of suspicion and preparation that constrained political evolution. In this sense, the Blue House raid stands as a defining moment in the Cold War history of the peninsula, not because it achieved its immediate objective, but because it reshaped the strategic environment, institutionalized fear as a governing principle, and demonstrated how close the region could come to catastrophe through a single operation that exploited the thin line between peace and war. As the Cold War moved beyond the immediate turbulence of 1968, the Blue House raid settled into the strategic memory of the Korean Peninsula as a reference point for both restraint and escalation, shaping how future crises were interpreted and managed by governments conditioned to expect sudden shocks rather than gradual normalization. And the raid's legacy lay in how it recalibrated thresholds of tolerance and response rather than in any formal change to military posture. For North Korea, the absence of catastrophic retaliation reinforced the conclusion that calibrated risk-taking could be sustained below the level of war, encouraging a long-term reliance on special operations, intelligence penetration, and symbolic violence as instruments of pressure that exploited the adversary's fear of escalation more effectively than conventional force. This logic did not depend on operational success, but on persistence, unpredictability, and the psychological burden imposed on an opponent forced to defend every space simultaneously, a burden that the Blue House raid had demonstrated could be imposed even on a heavily militarized state. South Korea, in turn, absorbed the episode into a broader narrative of permanent emergency, institutionalizing lessons that emphasized preemption, surveillance, and internal cohesion as prerequisites for survival, and embedding the expectation that future conflict would arrive without warning and through unconventional means, an expectation that justified sustained investment in security infrastructure and the normalization of extraordinary measures within everyday governance. This institutionalization shaped the evolution of South Korea's security state, reinforcing a political culture in which stability was equated with control and dissent was viewed through a security lens, narrowing the space for opposition and shaping policy choices well into the later Cold War period. The alliance with the United States evolved within this framework, as American planners increasingly recognized that deterrence on the peninsula required not only the prevention of large-scale invasion, but the management of a spectrum of provocations designed to test resolve without triggering war, a recognition that complicated alliance signaling and required continuous calibration of response. The Blue House raid thus contributed to a broader shift in Cold War thinking about limited conflict, illustrating how adversaries could operate in the gray zone between peace and war, leveraging ambiguity to impose costs while avoiding decisive confrontation. Internationally, the incident reinforced perceptions of the Korean Peninsula as an inherently unstable theater, where the absence of a peace settlement meant that crises could erupt suddenly and with disproportionate consequences, reinforcing the caution of external actors and constraining diplomatic initiatives that might otherwise have sought to reduce tension. The raid's memory also influenced South Korea's approach to legitimacy and development, as the regime linked economic progress and national modernization to security resilience, presenting growth and discipline as defenses against subversion and framing prosperity itself as a strategic asset in the confrontation with the North. This linkage between security and development strengthened the state's authority, but also entrenched a narrative in which political liberalization was deferred in the name of survival, a deferral that would shape South Korea's political trajectory until later. Transitions. Analytically, the Blue House raid exemplifies how assassination attempts and covert action functioned within the Cold War not merely as tactical gambits, but as strategic signals, communicating intent, resolve, and willingness to accept risk in ways that conventional deployments could not. The operation's failure did not negate its signaling value, as the mere fact of penetration into the capital carried meaning that endured beyond the firefights themselves, embedding fear and caution into strategic culture. As decades passed, the raid remained a point of reference in discussions of deterrence and escalation on the peninsula, illustrating the fragility of armistice-based stability and the ease with which localized actions could threaten to unravel it. The episode thus occupies a distinct place in Cold War history, demonstrating how the logic of confrontation in divided societies favored actions that exploited psychological vulnerability and institutional rigidity rather than decisive military engagement. By revealing how close the peninsula came to all-out war through an operation conducted by a handful of men, the Blue House raid underscored the enduring danger of unresolved conflict, and the extent to which peace in Korea during the Cold War rested not on reconciliation, but on constant vigilance, mutual fear, and the disciplined avoidance of irreversible steps, a precarious balance that could be upset at any moment by miscalculation or intent. In this way, the raid's legacy extended far beyond January 1968, shaping the mental architecture of conflict management on the peninsula and reinforcing a Cold War reality in which the most destabilizing acts were often those that stopped just short of open war. In its final historical balance, the Korean Blue House raid stands as one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War on the peninsula, precisely because it revealed how close the region could come to catastrophic escalation without a single conventional battle being fought. And as the years passed, the episode came to symbolize the unstable equilibrium that governed inter-Korean relations, an equilibrium sustained not by reconciliation or trust, but by deterrence, fear, and disciplined restraint. The raid demonstrated that assassination and covert penetration could function as strategic instruments capable of imposing shock and uncertainty disproportionate to their scale, exploiting the vulnerabilities of a divided society where political authority, national identity, and security were inseparably linked. For North Korea, the operation's legacy reinforced a strategic culture that valued audacity, deniability, and psychological impact over decisive engagement, embedding special operations and asymmetric pressure as enduring features of statecraft and confirming that provocation below the threshold of war could yield strategic dividends without triggering overwhelming retaliation. For South Korea, the near loss of its head of state crystallized a siege mentality that fused governance with security, legitimizing the expansion of surveillance, emergency powers, and centralized authority as permanent necessities rather than temporary responses, and shaping political life through the logic of existential threat. This fusion altered the trajectory of South Korean development, intertwining economic modernization with internal control and framing national progress itself as a defensive strategy against subversion, a linkage that strengthened the state while constraining political pluralism. The United States, observing the crisis and its aftermath, absorbed lessons about the limits of conventional deterrence in managing unconventional threats, reinforcing an approach to alliance management that emphasized crisis control, proportionality, and the avoidance of actions that could transform localized provocations into systemic war, an approach shaped by the recognition that escalation on the peninsula risked drawing in external powers with catastrophic consequences. Within the broader Cold War system, the Blue House raid illustrated how regional actors could generate instability that reverberated through superpower calculations, exploiting moments of distraction and structural restraint to impose pressure without direct confrontation, and highlighting the degree to which the global rivalry depended on the discipline of local actors to prevent catastrophe. The episode also underscored the fragility of armistice-based peace, revealing that the absence of formal war did not equate to security, and that unresolved conflicts created environments in which small actions could carry outsized risk. Analytically, the raid challenges narratives that frame Cold War stability solely in terms of superpower restraint, demonstrating instead that stability was often contingent on the constant management of peripheral crises where miscalculation could escalate rapidly. The Korean Peninsula in 1968 exemplified this condition, as a single covert operation brought the region to the edge of all-out war, exposing the thin margin separating deterrence from disaster. The fact that war was ultimately avoided owed less to the robustness of the armistice than to the calculated restraint of actors who understood the costs of escalation, reinforcing the paradox that peace was preserved through fear rather than resolution. In this sense, the Blue House raid occupies a critical place in Cold War history, not as a failed assassination alone, but as a demonstration of how psychological shock, asymmetric action, and political vulnerability could converge to threaten systemic stability. Its legacy endured in the patterns of behavior it reinforced, shaping inter-Korean relations through cycles of provocation and response that persisted long after the gunfire faded. The raid thus stands as a stark reminder that during the Cold War, the most perilous moments were often those that unfolded quietly and unexpectedly, driven by small units and covert intent, and that on the Korean Peninsula, the line between peace and catastrophe was never defined by treaties or borders alone, but by the constant, fragile discipline of restraint in the face of fear and unresolved war.